Hello and welcome to Market Open Direct Connect, a webinar series for companies to tell their story, why it's compelling and why it's an opportunity to invest. I'm your host, Stuart Walters, and we're joined here today by Neil Young, the Managing Director, and Greg Channon, the Chief Geoscientist at Elixir Energy, ASX code EXR. Neil and Greg will provide a detailed update on the recently concluded Daydream-2 program and participate in a Q&A with attendees. Attendees will have an opportunity to ask questions directly to Neil or Greg, and you could submit any questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. There has been a lot of interest in this webinar and already several questions submitted. We do only have 1 hour, so we will get through as much as possible. I'd like to introduce our guests, Neil, Greg. Welcome to Direct Connect, and over to you guys.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks attendees for dialing up and listening to our presentation and the Q&A. So later today, myself with Greg's assistance will be talking at a function in Perth, hosted by a petroleum body called PESA, and there'll be an element of technical aspects to the presentation, which I might skip over a little bit just now and leave a bit more time for the Q&A, which I'm sure is being eagerly sought, particularly after some of the ups and downs in our share price recently. So now I'll turn to the presentation and go through that with Greg's assistance from time to time. So the presentation is titled "A Major New Play Being Proven in Queensland's Taroom Trough." And we think that we're making very significant recent progress on that, as are some of our neighbours. So here's the usual disclaimer. So moving on and introducing the Taroom Trough. This is one of the few remaining places in Australia where a substantial known gas resource exists, and it's in a fabulous location. The Permian coals in the Bowen Basin, and the Taroom Trough is part of that, have sourced oil and gas fields on its flanks for a considerable number of years. But our view has been, and this has been supported by the industry over a long time, is a considerable amount of gas remains within the epicenter of the trough. We have had the view that the unique geology of the Taroom Trough means that tight gas developments there would be advantaged compared to some other locations that have been tried in Australia, particularly the Nappamerri Trough in the Cooper Basin, where just over a decade ago, companies like Chevron invested a lot, but without enormous success in pursuing tight gas there. One of the technical keys to this was stress modeling by Elixir, which recognized the importance of stress partitioning and anisotropy in the area, which resulted in us being able to derive what we consider to be an optimal fracture stimulation program based on the data known at the time. So as I said, the Taroom Trough is in the southern part of the Bowen Basin. This is a Permian-era coal basin of enormous extent and enormous wealth generation history and future. Just roughly to the north, the Bowen Basin hosts coking coal deposits that are amongst the world's best. In roughly the middle, as the basin deepens, there are massive coal seam gas fields which supply the LNG export parts fields in Gladstone. As we go deeper, there are the tight gas plays which we and others, including majors, are now pursuing. Now, in this location, we're next door to Wallumbilla, the premium gas hub in Australia. That means that pipeline costs to take this gas to market would be minimal. This area has hosted oil and gas for 100 years. There's long-term community acceptance of it. This is not a new thing. And what it also means is the oil field service sector in East Coast Australia is centred around this region, which means that procuring equipment is much more easily done than in remote locations. So what this means is that, in our view, that success in the Taroom Trough will attract large sources of capital, which is needed for gas. It's a capital-intensive industry. And our view is that the best source of capital for small players like us is attracting larger players. And if you have a play that is not attractive to larger players, you're going to have to go and fund it yourself, which can be difficult. As I said, it's a capital-intensive industry. So what are the factors here that could be attractive to large players? Well, firstly, it's brownfields. The large players are already there in Queensland, and for those who are not, then they can follow their peers. That's a much easier thing for them to do than go somewhere more virgin. Secondly, in this day and age, low emission profiles, that is low carbon dioxide, is a vital hurdle to be overcome for large companies to come in. And here we're very pleased to note that the CO2 is very low. Next, and this becomes self-evident, it has to be large. Big companies don't do small things. And the resource size here already is multi-trillions of cubic feet with potentially liquids as well, which means that billions of dollars can be deployed and really make a difference for the big companies. Next factor, it's low sovereign risk. Queensland's one of the better locations in Australia, and Australia, for its occasional faults, is still one of the best locations in the world. Last point, investments can be varied. This is an onshore play. That means there's far more optionality compared to an offshore play in terms of deployment of capital. An offshore play needs a single FID decision resulting in billions going in. Here, capital can be allocated on a step-up basis. Ultimately, billions will be required, but it can be timed at the discretion of the large companies. So add all those things together, we believe this is a great location to attract those large companies to come in, and that's always been one of the key parts of our strategy here. So the Troon, we believe, is the birth of a new unconventional play in Australia, what the industry characterizes as basin-centered gas, or BCG. In simple terms, these are tight reservoirs surrounding source rocks that have such low permeability that generating hydrocarbons can't escape. So that's called a permeability trap or goal or jail. So some good analogs from North America, the Piceance Basin in the USA and the Montney Basin in Canada. Both have produced an enormous amount of gas and share elements with the Taroom Trough, which is still in its very early stages compared to those massive plays. So the key elements are a regionally pervasive basin, which we absolutely have in the Taroom Trough, overpressure, which we've confirmed, abundant source rocks, which were known to exist and which we've actually flowed gas from, water saturation increasing up dip above the gas as permeability improves, but with no down dip water leg, and generally requiring stimulation to flow. And obviously we've been applying stimulation, as have our neighbors, to the wells in this region. So Daydream-2, truly the numbering indicates it's an appraisal well. It was drilled fairly proximate to an old British gas well called Daydream-1. And the objectives of an appraisal well in an unconventional play like this had the specific elements as follows. First, prove the BCG play is present. And we've done that, the pervasive accumulation of around 600 meters of gross interval over the entire permit size, which is 1,000 square kilometers. That's 241,000 acres, which for those who follow US companies is a very, very big land package. Now, overpressure was confirmed, 0.6 psi per foot. That meant that the total depth of our well, 4,300 meters, were only 10,000 psi. That's a very, very high pressure. That's an important feature of BCG plays and really increases the productivity per well. Hydrocarbon source, here it is the coals, and we have for the first time measured the actual gas content in those coals, and it was much higher than we expected, of in excess of 20 meters cubed per ton. Next fundamental objective, induced flow rates from multiple horizons, coals and sands. Now we achieved a real significant flow rate of 2.5 million a day, which we consider commercial for a vertical well. And probably more significant in the appraisal objectives was flowing and flaring from deep coals. That had never been done before in the Taroom Trough, and indeed these are the deepest coals flowed in Australia and potentially the world. We developed new strategies for stimulation, which could be applicable to the many hundreds, if not thousands, of future development wells that will be required here. For the first time, we used micropropellant to induce flows from the coal, on which, as I said, was a first. We developed a bespoke mechanical earth model, and we validated that through the stimulation program. And those led to number 4, obtain R&D funding from the federal government. We procured an advanced finding that our program in Daydream-2 would qualify, which meant that the federal government has financed us on an equivalent for a 2-to-1 farm-out basis for Daydream-2. So we've achieved multiple breakthroughs. Firstly, the mechanical earth model that I mentioned was being validated through the stimulation program. Coal's desorption via cuttings done for the first time identified a very high gas content in the coals. That meant that the gas in place in the coals over 1,000 square kilometers is enormous. and even applying a low recovery factor to that, we have the very high prospective gas resources now starting to move to contingent resources that we'll note in detail later on. We also had a first, and we free flowed gas without stimulation from a reservoir below 4,200 meters. That's rare. We applied pinpoint stimulation using microproppant in the coals in particular. That was very groundbreaking and original. We stimulated a deep coal zone and we flowed that for the first time. And crucially, we confirmed that CO2 was very low, 1 or 2%. That's pipeline specification. That reduces cost, it reduces tax potential threats, and it also increases the attractiveness to large suppliers of capital and partners. So here's quite a detailed slide. It shows the timeline over the last 3 years of the Grandis project. In 2022, we acquired the license area here after screening various options available to us. We finalized location, we booked an initial contingent resource. In 2023, we got ready for the commencement of drilling, which occurred and was very successful towards the end of the year. 2024 has been dominated by stimulation, increase in resource size, flowing gas, and getting to where we are just now, which is at this point the conclusion of the Daydream-2 program and the start of the next step of the journey for the Grandis overall program. So cracking the Taroom's code, we've made significant steps on this. In an unconventional play, the industry commonly refers to codes being cracked. There's a lot of trial and error involved in the various US tight gas and tight oil plays, which over the last 15 or so years have had many hundreds of thousands of wells drilled into them. When they started, things didn't work this way, it didn't work that way. Trial and error was applied by multiple operators, and eventually success was achieved, and then productivity improvements were just followed time after time as wells followed each other and as operators and service companies really understood the plays more and more. So in ATP 2044, to repeat, the primary play type is BCG, and this means the gas is permit wide and hence the very large contingent and prospective resource numbers which we have booked today. The Taroom Trough is a stack play. There are various horizons which bear gas, both sandstones and coals. They can be appraised vertically, they can be developed potentially vertically, deviated, or horizontals, and often the US history goes towards horizontals in the majority, but not all cases. The deeply buried permeable sands can provide sweet spots, such as we have flowed from the Laurel sandstone. The K there refers to permeability. That can really boost economics. We're at the very early stage of understanding the Laurel sandstone. There's a lot more work to be done in the decades to come. We don't know if it's pervasive or if it's small, but if it's anything more than small, it is significant contribution towards economics. At present, we are one of 3 operators who are actively working a program. Drilling away just now to our west is Shell, and they don't naturally say very much about our program, but we understand based on media reports it's going pretty well recently. To our east is an ASX peer called Omega, and they're active just now, and we wish both of those companies the best of luck. As I indicated earlier, the more people trying to crack the code in different ways, the better for all. If one cracks the code in their location, it is relevant to the others. And that is reinforced by a cooperative culture that we have with those companies, and also with, as we've announced previously, with Santos and Origin, with whom we've signed data and other sharing agreements. So I love quoting Churchill, as do many people of my vintage, and a quote post the British success in the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, I think is quite appropriate here. And that is to say, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. So the Taroom Trough, we in the next few slides here have a few more technical maps and graphs, etc. So I'll go through the highlights here. So the Taroom Trough is a proven oil and gas generating basin that has been the source rocks for many oil and gas fields over many decades in Queensland. There are now proven tight gas saturated reservoirs in the deep part thereof, and a large resource has been discovered. It's no longer been speculated about. there are significant booked, discovered, contingent resources that have been made by us and by our neighbors. When we add all this up, there are already multiple of trillions of cubic feet or TCFs of gas here. So going to our well, the Daydream-2 well, we spudded this at the end of last year. The overpressured section that was predicted was affirmed. Conservative well design dealt with that. Operations were safe, and we TD'd at 4,300 meters. That was the deepest well in onshore Australia outside the Perth Basin for a decade. The target section was intersected and was bigger than we expected. That was more than 600 meters of gross pay. And there were the sandstones there in the net pay was higher than expected, and the gas content in coals was very much higher than expected. New plays were also discovered. The permeable sandstone at nearly 10,000 psi at 4,200 meters. That caused a kick in our well, which was safely handled and ultimately flowed at a stimulated rate of 2.5 million a day. And the deep coals flowed gas to surface for the first time in the Taroom Trough's history. Gas-saturated reservoirs were discovered. We see here Daydream-2 and next door to Daydream-1. Gas shows were comparable between the two. All the sandstones and coals that were interpreted were gas-saturated as we expected, and no water-saturated reservoirs were encountered. Now, the net pay of sandstones was 180 meters. The net pay of coals was 65 meters. As we start to move coal into contingent resources, that will add to that pay total. And the perforated interval of that 245 meters was only 44 meters. So we only have perforated about 20% of the total pay here. So the Laurel sandstone here we see in the bottom of Daydream-2 where the kick occurred. It appears to have thickened as we went down dip from Daydream-1. Does that continue to thicken as we go down dip from Daydream-2? That will be of keen interest to the geologists and the economists in the future. So here is the Laurel sandstone closer up. That's just under 4,200 meters. And we see some features here under a microscope as to why the primary porosity and permeability is being preserved at these depths. And there are basically coatings on the sandstones which have achieved that. These have been seen elsewhere in places familiar to Australian investors such as the Perth Basin and very familiar to the international oil and gas industry in the Tuscaloosa sandstones in the Gulf region of the USA. So the desorption analysis of deep coals provided the more than 20 meters cubic ton figure I quoted earlier. Before we started, we expected the coals to maybe have expelled most of the gas that they had generated, but to see this amount still remaining in the coals led to that very high gas in place number that I alluded to earlier, and a potential recoverable amount from these coals of multi-TCF, prospective at this stage, but we have now initiated a process following flows of starting to move that to contingent resources. So here we illustrate the 6 separate stimulation stages that we undertook into both the early Permian, the Back Creek, and the later Permian, the Kianga, into both sandstones and coals in both. We had a bespoke stimulation program which underpinned the R&D funding support that we obtained, and some elements were an Australian first. Each individual stage had a different technique applied to reflect its different geological setting. I won't comment too much on the guar gel, but in total we put in £1 million, that's 450 tons of proppant successfully placed into these 6 separate zones. So micron proppant was a key element of the R&D element and the first in Australia. And this was particularly important for the coals where the fracture complexity tends to make it hard to keep the fractures open. But clearly flowing gas to surface, as illustrated on the flare photo there, was achieved. I won't go into too much here of the technical detail, but just to summarize this, Daydream-2 successfully pumped 2 jobs at 38 and 4,100 meters into coals, with gas noted from both of those, gas flowing from those, and that goes to the contingent resource booking that we have coming up fairly imminently. So here we illustrate the various gas flows achieved from the single Daydream-2 well over our journey. The successes include the first commercial flow of Permian gas in the Taroom Trough with the 2.5 million a day that we achieved a few months ago. The deepest unstimulated flow east of the Perth Basin, the deepest flow from a coal seam in Australia and potentially the world based on our search online. That started in December 23 with the kick in the well from the Laurel. We flowed that unstimulated in April. And then a few months later, after post-stimulated, we flowed it at nearly double. And we then flowed from the coals. Then we came back. There was a disappointing ending to the program, which we don't resolve from and which we've been investigating and will continue to investigate thoroughly with a final flow rate of about 1 million a day. So what caused that reduction in flow rate? Clearly, that is a matter of keen thinking for us. And our pretty strong conclusion is that skin and formation damage was built up over the extended period of testing, and that led to a substantial reduction in permeability around the wellbore. Now, there are various potential causes of this, which we are continuing to evaluate and think about. First one is clay rim swelling, and that can be caused by fluids being introduced into the wellbore and reacting negatively with clays, causing swelling and retarding flows. Or fluids that can be condensate or water might have banked up and again retarded flow rates. Fines could have moved from the formation towards the wellbore and again caused a reduction in flow rates. But it's critical to note from the Laurel in particular, there was no evidence of depletion noted on the pressure build up front. So what are the potential remedies to this? Is this caused by an intrinsic geological problem that just means that this well and potentially the play is irredeemably harmed? And the clear answer to that is a very strong no. These were caused by operational issues, which can be learned from and remedied in the future. The strategies to be implemented to do so include closely monitoring pressure drawdown from reservoir during testing operations, refining of fluid chemistry and monitoring during operations, logistics management to reduce time between operations, minimizing reservoir shock by limiting opening and shutting ins, and further learnings from a stimulation modeling to be incorporated into the next program. To reiterate, we're at a very early stage here. Daydream-2 is one of less than 10 wells that have been put into the thousands of square kilometers of the deep Taroom Trough. On the operational front, at this point in time, there is limited access to the rigs and the coiled tubing units that are capable of performing in the Taroom Trough. But what we already see are discussions about more equipment, more rigs, more CTUs coming in as we and our fellow operators look to the future. There's clear evidence that this happens all the time in oil and gas. As plays open up, equipment is tight. As they move forward, the service sector follows. For instance, we see in the Perth Basin a number of deep rigs now working. We saw obviously in the coal seam gas sector in Australia over decades, many rigs came in to support the many thousands of wells that have been drilled there. And that's just the nature of this game. To remember, we're at the pointy end of the spear here, but as the spear continues to follow, the service sector comes along with the journey. Here we illustrate the resource progression that we have achieved to date and what we expect to continue to achieve. We've booked 1.5 TCF of discovered contingent resources. I mean, at our current market cap, we're carrying a value there of about 5 cents a gigajoule, remembering a gigajoule sells for about $12 to $15. So there's a rather large gap there for upside. In addition, we have the prospective, that is the inferred resource, which is currently in the coals. That will start to get converted into contingent following the flow rates that we have achieved. Further drilling could add to contingent as we go deeper and flow from different horizons, and as we go stepping out geographically in this very large permit. And just in our appendices, we have various disclosures here, which the ASX typically insist upon here. So what have we learned? We think we've learned an awful lot, but remembering it's very early days. We've achieved 2.5 million a day. That's our definition of commerciality on this well. We have more than tripled our contingent resources to around 1.5 TCF. We've nearly doubled our prospective resources to nearly 4 TCF. We flowed gas from 2 separate deep coal zones, allowing the commencement of those gas therein into contingent resources. We've flowed gas from 5 out of 6 separate stimulated zones. We've confirmed CO2 as being low within pipeline spec. We've met all license commitments. That means we are now commencing a process of applying for conversion to retention lease. That means that we can hold this license area for up to 15 years without being forced to drill another well. Another well is at our election. And we've applied novel techniques and attracted significant Commonwealth government support. So in a very pithy summary, the gas is there. Productivity improvements will follow over the next well and over the hundreds, if not thousands of wells to follow. That is the clear history in US tight gas plays, which we expect to be replicated here in the Taroom Trough. Just quickly, this is something which is important to gain community buy-in, and clearly that we as an operator want to demonstrate that we do well to attract not only funding, but regulatory and community support. So just in the last section alone of our stimulation program, nearly 4,000 hours were worked with no safety incidents. Nearly 10,000 kilometers were driven with no incidents. Obviously, no road can be the biggest source of HSE problems in the oil and gas onshore sector. We placed £1 million of proppant in line with our plans. All operations were fully contained on the lease with no issues thereon. Our relationships with various local stakeholders, be it the local farmers, the landholder, the First Nations communities, are excellent. We've tried to inject money into the local economy using locally sourced accommodation and catering and service functions when we can, and that's been successful. So what are the next steps? Clearly, there's different horizons here. We're right in the middle of post-well studies. There's an enormous amount of data that we've gathered, which we're analyzing and integrating. We will very soon upgrade the contingent resources to include flows from the coals. We're progressing farm-out discussions, which, as I said, we believe will be attractive to large players given the characteristics of the Taroom Trough. We're applying for the retention lease, which gives us very firm tenure over the enormous amount of gas that I've described in an in-ground valuation, to the extent that that's meaningful, but it's a figure that people use, of $10 to $15 billion here. We have ongoing and growing cooperation with our neighboring operators. We've publicly announced deals with the likes of Origin and Santos. We also informally deal with the service sector and the neighboring operators who are active just now, and we expect that to continue. This is not an area of competition. The gas here is needed vitally by Australia and our export nations, and by cooperating, we can help crack the code as we try different things, as I've said a few times. We've started investigating infrastructure and offtake options. Thankfully, this is a great location that we don't need to build large pipelines. We're only less than 100 kilometers away from the Wallumbilla hub. Gas processing here is easy. There's no CO2 to be taken out, and liquids are very manageable. Daydream-3 options and planning therefrom are underway. Daydream-3 is a well that we can choose to drill. Our expected partners will no doubt inform how that next stage of the program goes ahead, though. So it's really about creating options for them. So in summary, and this is a bit more of an investor pitch, the world needs more gas for longer. The government recognizes that. East Coast Australia has fantastic pricing, a very strong supply gap emerging very quickly, and LNG plants with existing and growing ullage. Now that's attracted a number of operators in a number of locations to the Taroom Trough. And currently, if I add it all up, hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent, and we expect that to continue and to accelerate. Multiple achievements have been made at this early stage, and that is expected to continue as the code is cracked, the service sector comes in, IP is developed and shared. The results from Daydream-2 are an important part of that IP development and sharing. We've made multiple technical breakthroughs here, and we've now got a fantastic foundation, both in terms of asset ownership, of scale, and strength of tenure, and optionalities to take that forward through various sources of third-party and other capital in the future. So that's really it in terms of the presentation. To say, if you want, you can consider the attachments there, but otherwise I'll probably stop the share, and we can go to the Q&A part of the program, Stuart.
Neil, thank you. Fantastic presentation, extremely informative. I just want to let everybody know also that there will be a recording of this webinar released tomorrow, and it will be sent out through social media channels as well. We'll get straight on to the Q&A. Neil, first up, what have been the key success and learnings from the Daydream-2 program?
Okay, well, hopefully the presentation served to illustrate those. I think it's clearly been measurable successes in terms of the significant and multiple increases in resource bookings, both contingent and prospective. I mean, flowing gas to surface and flowing gas from 5 separate zones has been significant, achieving a stabilized flow rate of 2.5 million a day from the Laurel alone, a new discovered reservoir. The Laurel is great, but potentially flowing from the coals is even more valuable in the long term, given the enormous amount of gas in the coals and the very novel stage that we're at there. That if that code continues to be cracked, there's just so much gas can come from those coals. Confirming low CO2, that was vital because I believe that large companies won't go into new high CO2 plays, and it obviously means a lot in terms of being low cost. And then I suppose I'm really pleased to be cooperating with larger companies such as Origin Santos, Shell at an operational level. That's something that's not easy when you're a small company. And I'm also very pleased to be having developed a great relationship with local stakeholders and, of course, the Queensland government through its various regulatory bodies. So I think those things, hard and soft, and the soft ones are important as well, have been significant achievements.
Why was the final flow rate less than previously achieved?
I'll maybe pass one to Greg here, just so I can rest my voice for a little bit.
Yeah, look, thank you, Stuart. That's a good question. Look, as we described in the presentation, there was great disappointment as we opened up the final testing of the Laurel and, in fact, all the zones. And look, as we've analysed that, it's becoming clear that there has been formation damage and skin. And so the formation damage is basically something that's happened in the pore throats of the reservoir that are blocking it, and that's causing what we measure as skin against the interface between the wellbore and the formation. And there are 2 likely causes for that. One is that we've pumped something into the formation during the stimulation and testing phase when we had to do some remedial milling as well, and that has caused either a scale or a reaction with which we weren't expecting with some of the clays. Although there is a lot of illite obviously protecting the grains and causing our preserved porosity, there is certainly some smectite present as well, which could be of significance. We always try to use KCl and NaCl waters and fluids, but nonetheless, that could be a problem. Secondly, it could be that there's been some movement of fluids within the formation, and that could be either a condensate or a water banking or dropout, where we've seen the phase change from gas to water due to the large drawdowns that we see across the reservoir as we test. Or it could in fact be the migration of fines, which is possibly some microscopic rock fragments, which have again moved into the pore throats. So look, all these things, they're quite technical. We have an exhaustive amount of studies going on now, laboratory studies, water chemistry, to try and understand that. But these things are all remediable in future wells, and potentially even within this well, once we understand exactly what the issues are. So look, we're coming to a point where we think we know the problems, and from there we can develop the solutions.
Does the lesser flow rate materially devalue the Grandis project?
So I'll go to that one first, and clearly the answer is no. That flow rate doesn't change the resource bookings that we've achieved at all, and indeed, as I say, we expect to increase the contingent resources as we float gas from the coal. So the gas is there, and to go back to the phrase that I use, the challenge is now how to get it more effectively out. And that's a challenge that's been thrown down to the oil and gas industry in the large basins in America time and time again, and the industry has risen to absolutely thrash that challenge in the medium and longer terms. I mean, to use one analog, I remember about 5 or 10 years ago, there were about 500 rigs working in the gas patch in America. Now there's 100 producing 50% more gas. The productivity improvements are enormous, and I expect them to be replicated here.
What is the significance of achieving flows from the deep coals?
So I think the key point there is the gas that we previously assumed to be present in the coals was only the subject of a prospective resource booking. Actually flowing that gas means it can start to be converted to contingent resources. Now we've only got data from one well here. This was the first where that's been undertaken. As more data points come in, more and more contingent resources can be booked from those coals. But it's this commencement of the journey that is significant, and that's been a massive breakthrough for us here.
Is the impact of a disappointing flow rate similar to a dry hole outcome for a conventional exploration well?
I'll maybe pass it on to Greg.
Yeah, well, look, definitely not. So this is an unconventional play that does not require structuring, and the gas is present across the whole block in a very pervasive way. And we see it both obviously in Daydream-2 well, but also in other wells that have been drilled surrounding our block, both to the west, the east, and to the north. And so the gas is there. And if I could just say, use a colloquial phrase, we just haven't used the right type of straw to get it out yet. And so that will be the challenge in the well to come.
And what is a retention lease?
So that's a practice in the oil and gas industry, which Australia's adopted for many decades, whereby a company makes a discovery, but it's not yet commercial, but it's expected to be commercial at some point in the future. The regulator then gives long-term title to the owner of that resource without requiring it to do more exploration, drilling, or appraisal work in the interim. As market prices change, as technology improves, and other factors like that can make that resource economic. So a retention lease is enormously valuable because of that. And there's a clear process in Queensland, and both our westerly and easterly neighbours have followed this to obtain retention leases over their Taroom Trough acreage. So we've commenced that program with the regulator here. What it means is that for the large parties who we're having the farming discussions with, they will see that as being enormously valuable. It's much more valuable than just an exploration license.
Neil, do you plan to redrill or redo the stimulation program on Daydream-2? And if not, why not?
So I think I'll maybe get Greg to help me with a little bit here, but I think I'd firstly start by saying, I mean, Daydream-2's purpose was to gather data, including flowing gas. Its purpose was never to be a production well, although it can be used for that in the future. So now we've got to ask ourselves, what is the best deployment of capital from here to get more data, to further de-risk the play, to move on the journey towards development? And our conclusion at this point is not to go back into this well and to try more things. It's to gain data from a new well, Daydream-3, which we have various options in our planning horizon for. Greg, anything to add on that front?
Look, I think you've covered that, Neil. Look, we need to analyse and integrate all the data that we've gained. Look, when, of course, we were doing the final phase of testing, we had the opportunity to do more and more remedial work. But look, we felt it was best actually to call a pause to that work and go back to the laboratories and make sure that we understand everything before we continue on. So look, it could be an option in the future, but the well has been suspended. It can be a commercial producer moving forward on a go-forward basis. I think we need to complete our work before we can determine that.
Why were you drilling an appraisal well, not a production well?
I think people tend to ask that question because production well obviously produces revenue, and that's vital for a business. And we expect the Taroom Trough to produce an enormous amount of revenue in the future. But an appraisal well's purpose is not to produce revenue; it's to gain data in the most efficient way possible. And we've gained an enormous amount of new data, as I've been describing in various aspects of the presentation early, on various horizons, doing various things that people have never tried before. So in that sense, it was enormously successful, and its design and the way that we approached it operationally reflected that data gathering objective rather than maximizing flow rate objective. Clearly, we wanted to maximize flow rate, but the various operational issues which you've alluded to obviously caused some issues that we've described, which arose there.
Does a disappointing flow rate from an appraisal well happen often in the gas industry? And do you have any stats available?
So I'd say the question is really one that should be bifurcated into conventional and unconventional plays. And in a conventional play, a disappointing flow rate, if caused by the wrong things, can kill an area. In an unconventional play, which is regionally pervasive, as Greg was describing, is the case in our block and across the broader Taroom Trough, it doesn't do that at all. What it does is provide lessons that can be applied through a trial and error and technical and scientific basis to be applied to the many future wells that will be required. So in that sense, I just want to reinforce it's completely different. I mean, we've seen in the Perth Basin, unfortunately, some wells have been drilled by various operators which have come up dry. They have then reduced the amount of gas resources in those plays. In an unconventional play like the Taroom Trough, a well does not cause dryness and reduce resource size. It rather provides lessons that go to the application of future wells. So I'd say in unconventional plays, early stages, these things happened all the time. When the American pioneers applied horizontal drilling and stimulation, 15 or so years ago, there were many things that didn't quite work. What they then did in classic and admirable American spirit was apply capitalism and daring and to go ahead and try different things. And eventually they created the world's easily largest producer of oil and gas, and that is the American economy today. And hopefully we in the Taroom Trough can be part of that classic Western capitalist tradition and really smash it out the park. Doing it on one of the first 10 wells is unlikely. We had a chance of getting there, but falling a bit at the last hurdle in terms of flow rates didn't retard the overall play at all. So this is a key question, hence the length of my answer. And Greg, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh no! Look, I think you're exactly right, Neil. In the US, the first wells were very expensive. They took a long time to drill, and flow rates weren't as good. And so again, we talked about cracking the code. We've begun that process, but there's a lot to come. And so the key outcomes I think have been met in this well. As you say, we did fall at the last hurdle, but that is a very operational issue which can be remedied moving forward and doesn't affect the greater play overall.
Neil, when do you plan to drill Daydream-2 well, and how much cash is required for this?
So Daydream-2, well, firstly to emphasize, we don't have to drill Daydream-2 as a commitment well under the license, given the retention basis that we are confident of pursuing. However, we are working on options to drill Daydream-2, and they will finally land upon objectives that could be shared by an incoming partner. So the timing could rest upon the status of the negotiations with those incoming partner. And if they're the large company we expect, they might have different views as to how the next stages of the appraisal program should be developed. And we obviously want to create options for that. In terms of funding, so we have received significant funding for Daydream-2 from an R&D program, and we are confident that can continue into the future. Clearly, if we bring in a partner, it will fund a significant ongoing appraisal program, including Daydream-3. And there are other funding sources as well outside raising equity, which we have in mind. And I think the history of Elixir in recent years is one of reasonable innovation, such as the deal that we did with Elixir Energy, who paid for part of the Daydream-2 costs for the data that we gathered for them from that. So I think shareholders can rest assured that we have quite a number of options here. We don't have to do something here if we don't want to, but we're certainly working on numerous fronts to continue this appraisal program.
Why are you confident farming parties might be interested in coming into the play?
So I obviously alluded to this point in the presentation. I think that the first one is the fact that we have a super major to our immediate west putting in hundreds of millions of dollars into this play says a lot to its peers. These big companies are slow and conservative. When they move, they do things, as Trump might say, in a bigly way. They put a lot of money, they put a lot of effort into things. The fact that one of their peers is doing that is an enormous endorsement as to why they might do it as well. Secondly, a lot of these companies are in the LNG plants in Gladstone, which have existing and growing spare capacity. There's an enormous incentive to find gas to push through those plants. And then even domestically, there's a very valuable and high price market to capture here. And so we believe all these things add up to an enormous opportunity for the big peers of Shell to look at this play. And as we flagged for a while, we are in discussions with these guys. They don't necessarily move quickly, but prima facie, it is of interest.
Does the company plan to continue development in the Taroom Trough, or will you be looking to acquire new projects elsewhere?
So hopefully the conclusion reached from hearing us today is that absolutely the Taroom Trough is our focus. Now, clearly, if the best deal ever in the world came up, we'd be stupid not to look at it. But the Taroom Trough has got so much opportunity for us, for a company of our size to be playing in a multi-TCF play of this level of interest and technical upside. There's so much to do here that it's highly unlikely that we find anything that would distract us from that.
And what gives you confidence that there'll be an upside potential for gas development in the Taroom Trough region?
Again, I suppose it's not only what we've achieved, but what our neighbours are achieving as well, particularly when one of them is a super major. That's an enormous endorsement of the opportunity here. And I say collectively, and particularly if we include the British gas money spent a number of years ago, there's more than $500 million gone into this already. I mean, that's not foolish money. And we expect that to continue in the months and years to come. And I think following the money tends to be a pretty sensible thing to do in our and many other industries. And so that gives that degree of confidence.
Another one here, other test results and apparent potential up to this time of Daydream-2 shared by Dud or successful wells drilled by Shell or Santos?
So Santos to date hasn't drilled a well in the Taroom Trough. They've got acreage to our north and south. Shell, I mean, clearly don't say much about what they are doing. They own their acreage 100%, and they're a massive $250 billion company, whatever they are just now, and so it's not hugely relevant for them to report that to their regulators and shareholders. So what we say is anecdotal, but what we understand is that Shell has drilled 3 horizontal wells into their acreage over the last year. That the media has reported a pretty successful flow rate from the second of those wells. We understand that the first well was less successful, but that goes to this whole trial and error thing that I've said is common in this space. We understand that Shell will wrap up that program within the next few months, and obviously we in the industry will be keenly observing what the media and others might report about that. We obviously are talking to companies like Shell about cooperation on rigs and such like in the future, and we would hope to see them follow up with a significant program in the years to come. And unless there's corporate reasons not to do that, we'd be reasonably confident that that would be the case.
Neil, can Daydream-2 well be repaired and allow gas to flow at previous flow rates prior to stimulation?
I'll maybe get Greg to talk to that one.
Yeah, look, I think as we mentioned earlier, look, we think the well can be put into production in due course from the lower Lorelle. I think that reperforating or refracking the well is something that can be considered in due course, but we need to complete our studies to understand that before we would make any decision on that basis.
How advanced are discussions with other companies to sign a JV partnership for Grandis?
So clearly that's a question which is difficult to answer because those discussions are confidential, and also I suppose no negotiation is done until someone signs it, and so predicting a time frame is difficult. We have been talking to these large companies for a while, warming them up considerably on what is happening here, but these companies move at their own pace, so I wouldn't expect to sign something within weeks. I wouldn't expect it to sign it within years. So I can't really be more accurate than that.
And this question come in around Mongolia. Will there be, when will it be known if Nongon will be declared as commercially viable?
Again, it's somewhat like me answering as to how long's a piece of string, because it's an early stage pilot production program. We have announced some pressure drawdowns, but as I say, it's fairly early stage, and clearly our primary efforts corporate wise have been going into the more valuable Queensland play over the last few years. We'll provide the market with an update on that in the months to come. And
how is Mongolia progressing?
As I say, we've been allocating capital primarily to Queensland, and in Mongolia, our efforts have really been on conducting the very early stage and long-term pilot production process. That is ongoing there, and in the months to come, when we hope to see some desorption gas breakthrough, we'll obviously give updates on that and see where we get to.
Is there any plans for a capital raise?
Well, we're a company with no revenue, so at some point that might arise. It could be speculated upon, but as of today, we have no plans for a cap raise.
What are the solutions for the current bottleneck of restricted gas supply in the pipeline?
I'm not sure the question is to Australia as a whole or to the well. So I think if it's to Australia as a whole, the country lacks options. I mean, there is a fairly advanced an LNG import plant being built in New South Wales, and that's going to be absolutely required, and there's probably going to be 1 every 2 required in Victoria. In terms of gas supplies, I mean, you can just basically give up in Victoria and New South Wales for the reasons that we've seen over the last few decades, which means that gas has to come from either Queensland or the Northern Territory or imports, and it could be all three. If I look at Queensland, there's really 2 large sources of gas. There's the Southern Bowen Basin, the Taroom Trough, which is next door to infrastructure around Wallumbilla. There's the Northern Bowen Basin, where there's extensive coal seam gas fields, but they're not connected by pipeline. They're more distant. And then even more distant is the NT, where there's obviously been a lot of investment into the horizontal tight gas plays there. That gas can come to the East Coast, but clearly at a higher cost given that greater distance.
Can you elaborate on how 2.5 million is considered commercial?
Greg, can you touch on that?
Oh, look, certainly. So, look, we've built extensive models of the potential of the field. We've modelled from the initial flow rates, the expected ultimate recoverable resources. We've estimated the costs, and when we mix those through our economic model, that shows that at about 2.5 million cubic feet per day, which means a well might recover ultimately, 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 BCF of gas. If we can recover that from each well, then we believe that would be economic, given all the other parameters, operating costs, capital costs, and of course the fiscal structure. So that's based on our economic models.
And can you elaborate on the porosity? Sorry, Neil.
Sorry, Stuart, I'll just add to that. I mean, I suppose the key factor in that economic modelling is pricing. We assume $10 at the wellhead, 10 Australian dollars, and certainly gas pricing is higher than that just now. If we go to $12, $15 that could be legitimately modelled, then that flow rate comes down for a break even reasonably substantially. For those who've been in the game a long time and just were brought up in the days of $2 or $3 gas, 2.5 million a day from a deep well seems counterintuitive. But that increase in gas prices, which is structural and permanent, and which is increased by a factor of 300 or 400%, just makes that cutoff point enormously different, and hence that rate that we've got there. So sorry, Stuart, back to you.
Can you elaborate on the torosity and redirection of fracture propagation or stress regime?
So, Greg, that's one for you.
Yeah, that's quite a mouthful. Look, we've got again extensive models of the fracs and the way that they were placed inside the formation. We use experts from the University of Queensland and others around the world to determine how we place our proppant and our fractures and their ability to move through the rocks, given the stress regime and the tortuosity that we see. So I think we could write probably a paper. I could speak for an hour on that. But the bottom line is that since we've undertaken these fracs, we now go through a post-stimulation review, where again we model those against the results versus the amount of proppant and the amount of fluid that we've pumped in, and we derive outcomes which we can use to really plan the next phase of the program.
And what is the final cost of Daydream well, excluding fracs?
So excluding the fracs, the drilling cost, if that's what the question is leading to, was around probably slightly less than half the total cost of the well, and And that's without taking account, obviously, of the R&D support that we've been talking about. So stimulation and testing is expensive, and obviously we had a bit of an interruption earlier in the year as we replaced Halliburton with Condor on the stimulation front. So typically on these things, you'd expect it to be about half and half, but with the delays we had on the stimulation front, the drilling became probably slightly less than half.
And why do you think the combined flow rate was not additive to the stabilize the roll 2.5 million?
Greg?
Well, look, there's no doubt that the lower Lorel, which was flowing, did dominate the flows over the entire zone. So the 2.5, as it was coming up, I think did have impact on the zones above, and to some degree, that's a learning that we're going to be taking forward as to whether we should do more isolation of these zones rather than cumulatively combining them.
Could there be an entrapment of water within the zone?
Yeah. Oh, do you want me to do that one, Neil?
Yes, thanks, Greg.
Yeah, so look, I think if we're talking about within the pore spaces, yes, that is a possibility. Look, we will note that there's really wasn't any significant water produced in any of these tests. In terms of the water that did come back, it was mainly related to the frac fluid that we put in. So really, there's really not that much water in the system. Now, there is high irreducible water within the rocks. That's well recognised in these types of rocks. The petrophysics shows that, and so it is possible that the water has moved into the pore throat. So that is one potential cause of our problem.
Read the coal. It was mentioned that no flow rate was recorded. If the upgraded perspective to contingent resources requires flow rates, how will the contingent resource be established?
Okay, so on that one, a contingent resource requires the fact of flowing, not an absolute rate. An absolute rate is relevant to economics, and hence the moving of contingent resources to reserves. So that's the simple answer there.
There's another one that's come in here. What method of analysis did you use to determine clay swelling was one of the causes of formation damage? What approach will you take to mitigate these cause in the future wells?
Greg?
Yeah, well, look, so look, I must point out that as we began the stimulation program, we did undertake extensive testing with our the stimulators that contractors that we used, and so we did review the fluids that we used, and we did laboratory study to determine that they were inert with respect to the samples that we had. Look, notwithstanding that though, we have done petrographical analysis of the sands that were drilled, and we've determined that there is multiple types of clay present. And so that work will now expand in the coming months to determine exactly if that is indeed a cause. So we're not completely sure that it is, but we suspect it may be one cause of the problem we have around the wellbore in the immediate vicinity.
Thanks, Greg. Unfortunately, we've only got time for one more before our scheduled webinar closes, but all questions will be passed on to management. And thank you to everybody for putting your names next to it as well, because we'll have your details. Are there any, or as there are multiple other exploration players in the area, are you sharing flow and other technical information with each other to ensure issues minimised and not prevented?
Okay, so I suppose to the extent that we are small listed companies, then we tend to announce information, and our peers of that similar size will no doubt be following that. And to be honest, you know, those peers we know very well and we talk to a lot. In terms of the larger companies, where there's more disparity of size and culture. Now, as I said, with Santos and Origin, we've had formal data sharing agreements under which we exchange information. Through the service companies, a lot of information is passed in effect with them as a nexus. With Shell, we've established a good operating relationship as equipment is moved backwards and forwards from sites. And also, as you'd expect in our farm out negotiations, from time to time, we have entered into confidentiality agreements with large companies under which we disclose data. So that there's a lot of information going around. Also, ultimately, the regulators get all the information. And in Australia, after a period of time, typically 2 years for some information, then data becomes public for everyone's benefit. So there's a lot of information gets shared in various formal and informal ways here, such that, as I said, the cracking of the code tends to happen collectively through those various mechanisms.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Greg. Such an informative webinar today with presentation and Q&A. That does conclude today's webinar. For more information about Elixir, you can head to the company website, elixirenergy.com.au, or you can follow the social media channels as well. Thank you to everybody for attending. I will run a Q&A with Neil in the early stages of next week, and we may cover the rest of these questions. So thank you very much to everybody for attending. Guys, keep up the great work and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Stuart.